All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Enjoy the Book of Life. We're here with another book review. This time it's called 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. Very delightful book to read through. Really excited to do this review. Even mentioned it last week when we were talking about the year in review. So very excited to be back here with Todd. So let's just jump in. What's the premise of this book?
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. I appreciate it. And yeah, this is a little bit of a different book, I think, than we've talked about in the past. And the listener might say, "Well, wait a minute, where is this headed?" And I know the purpose of your podcast is to focusing on enjoying the Bible and the true spirit. But so it's by a gentleman named Tony Reinke. So I might start actually with him. So he is the little I know of him is he's a writer for Desiring God and under John Piper's oversight. And he writes, and he admits at the beginning of the book that he writes a lot online.
Yeah.
So he admits that a lot of his work is done online, social media, internet. So he readily, and I'm sure you probably came across, oftentimes admits that he has weaknesses in the realm of electronics and
Yeah.
social media and smartphones. So the goal of this book, and I loved it from the outset, is because I maybe you could think of some too, but I could think of some people that are on both ends of the spectrum, where
Yeah.
they're either saying technology is horrible, look at the way it's going with smartphones and AI and social media and pick whatever tech you can think of. It's all dangerous, stay away from it. We can just have the minimalistic approach to life. And I can think of the other ones. No, no, it's perfectly fine. Anything we do, we'll figure it out.
Or and even to when anything new pops up, they're on it,
Yeah.
right? Even to
Yes.
that,
They're the
they're on
early
the
adopters.
far
Yeah.
reaching. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the early adopters are like, no, no, it's perfectly fine. All the kinks have been worked out.
Yeah.
But what Tony tries to do is he really takes a pause and say, okay, listen, any technology, look at technology in the past. You think of cars, you think of bikes, you think of vending machines. You know, regardless, I mean, you could go way back in time, hundreds of years and thousands of years. There's iterations that we had that we've grown. Oh, I think he might have even used the plow, or actually, I think that might have been the book that changed your world that I was thinking of too. But um, when you look at technology, it could be used for good or for bad, or maybe not as effective as it was meant to be, or it depends on the person using it. And
Yeah.
I think that John Piper, even in the foreword, talks about using it as a tool
Yeah.
and not being led by it, that we are leading in and using it properly. So, and I want to say that at the outset because Tony really tries to say, okay, how can we use it to honor God and to not just put ourselves through this drivel of randomness that we pop online and see and get sucked in? And how do we be aware of that too? Because when you're like you're kind of sucked in, you're unaware of things going on around you or even how much time you spend there. So that's his premise. He's like, I'm not taking it good or bad. I want to just take
Yeah.
it, front and center, honestly how it is. And I think he slices and dices it through these chapters of there are some rabbit trails you can go down that are dangerous, problematic, what have you. There are also some ways that can be God honoring and amazing to your spiritual life. So that's the premise. I would say that I think the introduction is huge. So the way the book is set up is that he has 12 chapters of the 12 ways your phone is changing you. But there's
Yeah.
no real introduction chapter. It's the introduction. So I would encourage people to definitely read that
Yeah.
because he sets that up well of the technological advances throughout
Yeah.
history that I just mentioned. So
And
uh,
I think that's helpful in that, we get an idea in our mind when we think technology. And he
mhm.
just enlarges that and it really puts the idea of the smartphone in context. And
Yes.
I think that's really what helps set the premise of a balanced view.
Mhm.
So that it's not too far one way or too far the other.
Yeah. So yeah, for example, yeah, we might say technology and might go right to AI or virtual reality or something extreme that we have now, but you might not think of the printing press. And like,
Yep.
let's think about when the printing press kicked in a few hundred years ago. That was amazing and obviously great ways we can read books, the Bible, and many others. So yeah, take it for the broad scope and throughout history how it's panned out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
So with this, you
Hmm.
mentioned that you've got the introduction and then these 12 different ways. So what issues are covered? You mentioned these different kinds of rabbit trails, and how does he approach these different topics?
Yeah. So I thought about this before you and I were going to do our talk because I don't want to give too much away
Yeah.
for those that would be interested in diving into this book, but enough to whet the appetite and to give a sense of what's in here. So what I would say is, and even in the introduction uh, part that I was mentioning, he has 9 points, and then
Yeah.
he has these 12 chapters. He's very regimented in how he organizes, and it's bite size, even in the chapters where you can get to little
Yeah.
subsections and take it well. But each of the chapters are very well done. So I'll give you examples. There's a couple. There's one called "We Are Addicted to Distraction." There's "We Feed on the Produced." We get lonely. So and so he'll take that. What happens as we as natural beings and what our struggles and tendencies are, and how that kind of comes to light even more so in smartphones and social media, and what should we do because of that. And so we can get into, I guess, in a little bit, but that's the basic approach. What he kind of leads with, like an understanding of maybe a vice or something about ourselves that's makes us feeble or um, limitations, I guess, that we might have in our lives. And so another one is we get comfortable in secret vices. So it goes
Yeah.
into ways we can kind of have our secret vices inside, quietly hidden, um, and phones help you do that. So uh, I would say that his chapters are very well researched,
Mm-hmm.
organized.
Yep.
And I think I mentioned this to you when I suggest this book was you might go into some of these chapters and say, yeah, he has no Bible verses to support this, or
Right.
he's talking about technology and I forget when this was written, I think 2017 or something. Yeah, 2017. He's written this writing this 6 years ago. How's he going to talk about things using scripture to back it up? But he has excellent examples
Yeah.
that pull in that I'm like, he is not reaching. It's very applicable. It was
Yeah.
really impressive. So he really took his time there rather than just pulling a C.S. Lewis quote or something out of the hat.
Yeah.
Um, so that's, I think, the overall, and then I think the conclusion is really helpful too, which we could maybe go into later. But he really tries to piece it all together to say, how do we make this applicable? How do we make this, like I said, not one of the two extremes? Not because he's like, don't just throw your phone out the window.
Right. Right.
Like, there's still some benefits you can have from it. How do you do that? How do you assess? Am I doing too many hours? Am I on this app too much? Am I using this wisely, that wisely? Am I balancing out with the Bible and other things? So he has a good conclusion too of where do we
Yeah.
go from here.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate his combination because he pulls in scientific data and
Hmm.
studies and things like that. He brings in cultural situations, things that,
Yep.
we're very familiar with in 2023, even though this was written a few years back, very for today.
Hmm.
But then, like you said, not a stretch at all. These good biblical applications to say, hey, remember this verse? Well, I think it fits perfectly here. And you're like, wow, and to see those and those underpinnings, I think it's been it was really helpful to think through
Hmm.
going
Yeah,
through that.
and not just well, I think you said scientific or mathematical data, but he also goes into, like, he gives some Lewis Chesterton, some theological quotes to make you think about what's happening in whatever chapter he's covering. But also he goes into psychological and emotional, where he talks about what's happening with your brains, what's happening with your desires and things like that, where he'll pull from some secular, data or quotes or things like that too. So he's very eclectic in helping us understand what's going on from a just worldly, just like human being standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what are some of your favorite portions or things about this book?
Yeah. I actually wrote out a little bit about four. I kind of picked four chapters that I appreciated and really stuck out to me. And maybe I could just mention them real quick. And like I said, I won't go into them too
Yeah.
much to ruin some of the reading, but it's a really great book. Like I said, again, I would emphasize, I think he used biblical passages really well. Um, and I think he has a very good balance throughout the book of not positive, not negative, like just take it face value and see where the dust settles to really understand there could be some negatives here. There could be some positives that are honoring to God. Where does that fall? How do we understand that?
Yeah.
So one chapter is we become what we like. Sorry, we
Mhm.
become like what we like.
Yeah.
And I think that we've seen this where we kind of see it in the Bible too, where who or what you worship, you kind of become like that
Right.
too. And
Right.
that's a beautiful thing when you're worshiping God because you want to be like him and his good characteristics and what he's trying to do for you. But if you are worshiping idols, selfish idols that are well, like can't talk or speak or hear or you're kind of worshiping yourself, and we could that might be for another time. But and I think that's the point of his chapter there. He actually starts with, I think it starts with the story of Narcissus in
Yeah.
Greek
Yeah.
mythology, where Narcissus is just staring at himself every day because he's so in love with his face, and he falls in a well and dies. And so he's saying, with our phones, we might not think it, but we are kind of like Narcissus because even though you're like, okay, yeah, I'm looking at ESPN or I'm looking at whatever app, but you're looking at things that serve yourself, that
Hmm.
you like, that confirm more or less. I mean, you're not really having things that are knocking you down three pegs or or
Yeah.
constructively criticizing you. Like for the most part, you're doing things that are suiting you and teeing up your life pretty nicely. So he's kind of saying you're kind of living in that world. Be aware of that. Be
Hmm.
aware that it's kind of like looking at yourself in a mirror a lot.
And
Which
even
we should,
now that we learn about how the algorithms kind of work and they feed you what you like. And so it's
yeah,
kind of like this cycle. And even if that's not your intention, you spend enough time on it, it can result in that where
yeah,
as you spend time on it, it's going to develop that. Yeah.
yeah. And the other quote. So actually, I'm sorry, I was in that. I think another point that I probably should have said at the outset, but and you may have noticed this is it's a book about how your smartphone's changing you, but he actually talks a lot about social media.
Yes.
Um, and maybe he's just assuming that a lot of people are on that because they're on their phones, or because it's so ingrained in how a smartphone works. They're
Right.
they're very similar in how they approach. So one of the quotes in this chapter is he says, "We are who we think other people think we are,"
Hmm.
and how a lot of times it's not even we are who people think we are. It's we want we it's like it's like three rabbit trails. You have to figure out that where we're worried about what people think we are,
Yeah.
and we want to think that way. So um, I think he just is cautious of that and talks about that a little bit in this chapter, but and he pulls in some points about the commandments and like I said, just being aware of selfism, I think,
Yeah.
in this chapter.
Hmm.
Yeah. And it's I think he also talks a little bit more about social media and how you're starting to portray what you want to portray and what you think other people would like about you. And then it's like this snowball effect that you have to do it a little bit better and a little bit more till you're suddenly 1,000% in it. When at the beginning you might have been like just dabbling.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it's it's something that, and I think he uses this often where he's saying these are not things that are necessarily God dishonoring at the outset, but they can be if you're not aware of these um, problems that arise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Another chapter he talks about we fear missing out. I think that's a
Hmm.
big one today. People say FOMO, the fear of missing out. And I thought he started with a story. It was an Amish woman who had been in the Amish community. Do you remember this for 18 years?
Yeah.
And I forget she left the community, and I think she was living in, I believe it was a big city, but kind of in the technological society that we're in, and had kind of been ingrained in smartphones and internet and what have you. And then she had to go on a missions trip. It wasn't long after her 18th birthday, I think. And he mentioned how she was really struggling with being away from her phone and from technology.
Yeah.
So his point was like, look, we we think it's just because we're in like it's so easy for anyone to do it. It's not just, oh, well, you've lived with it all your life type of thing. Um, but our phones facilitate that where you have, I mean, I have BBC sends me alerts like anything something happens. So yes, I can turn that on. I can turn it off, leave it on. Um, do I? And I think that's part of the conclusion, right? He's like, do you think having alerts like that are good? Do you think that getting on the second you wake up is good?
Right.
Do you think the
Right.
amount of time you're on it is good? So, this fear of missing out kind of plays in here where it's like maybe there's ways I can truncate that or mitigate it down a little bit where I'm being more respectful, redeeming the time, yet still not just tossing the phone out the window, like a good balance.
Yeah. It was interesting.
Yeah.
He ties that back into the very first temptation in the Garden of Eden, where the serpent says, he's holding out on you, right? You could be like gods,
Mm-hmm.
or like God, and you're missing out. And it was essentially that same root fear
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to that very first temptation. Yeah.
Yeah, very applicable story that I think is exactly what Eve was tripped on because yeah, it was well, I mean, it's selfish that she wanted to not miss out on that.
Hmm.
And I think that's a lot of times today. And I think another good point in this chapter was too, if I forget how much he highlighted it, but we know that now there's been studies that have shown that people that are so ingrained in social media, because of that mindset we've been talking about a little bit of pleasing others and making yourself be so like perfect in the eyes of the internet that there's anxiety and there's depression, there's
Hmm.
emotional issues that people have. That's why they're saying like younger kids should be very careful, or maybe not have a phone for a bit. I think that's in a chapter I wasn't going to allude to, but it's we feed on the produced.
Yeah.
That everything is
Yeah.
so produced and put on a stage and perfected. Instagram. You're tweaking these pictures all the time and editing and cutting things, and um, we're so used to that it feels like real life,
Yeah.
and yet it's leading to anxiety, depression, and such like that. But we can't rely on the world to say, oh, we should do this. We should understand in the sight of God, what we're doing with our lives, with our minds, with our phones, with our hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so those were two. The other two that I thought were really awesome, where we lose our place in time, and I think that you'd say, okay, well that's obvious. We lose our place in time. You're doing the death scroll, as they say. You're just scrolling through, and then you suddenly realize it's an hour later. And
Yeah.
he does
Yeah.
talk about that for sure. He talks about that, and he talks about some unique nuances there. But what I appreciated a lot about this section was he emphasizes that it's not only that is
Mm.
one component of fear of losing time, or our place in time, I should say. But he talks about how we are, and you could correct me if I'm not explaining this correctly, but he's basically saying we are removed from the real life that we're in. We have family, kids, we're trying to witness to people, trying to encourage people, work at our jobs, whatever, so
Yeah.
many natural things in life that we have to do. But once we're removed, and let's say we're on our phone playing a game on social media, watching a video, that in that we are displacing and forgetting the purposes and the meaning of the natural life, the life that God wants for us and has for us, and we're stuck in that, let's say, video or what have you, and the purpose and meaning of that. So I think in, like, let's say a video game, for instance, there's obviously an objective that you have to do. But with videos, like hey, there's advertisements that pops up, or there's something that's funny and trying to catch your eye, or they just want you to watch another one that's just like that. There's purpose and meanings and objectives in everything we're clicking on that's making us forget the real world.
Right. Yeah.
Not necessarily bad at the outset, because I mean, you kind of have to. It's with books, fictional
Right.
books are like that too. You have to
Right.
be in that book to understand the fictional story that's going on. However, when you're literally forgetting, and he talks about God forgetting. So he's like, you're basically God forgetting, because God has intentionally put things in this world for you to do, to love, to learn, to see, to interact with, and you're not, because you're in this phone world.
Yeah.
I thought that was really huge. And we could go into other examples,
And
but that's, I think, the thing that
yeah,
really stuck out in that chapter for me.
even this idea, I appreciated the example he said of like answering an email. So if we're here, we are talking to each other, and
Hmm.
I say something in real time, and you have to respond to, if I ask you a question, then you respond to me, and we're still in this moment, right? Whereas if I send you an email, and you may not get it for a couple of hours, and then you sit there, you read it. When you're reading it, it isn't in like real time because I sent it and you're responding. And so even in that moment, it's not that the same as us having a conversation. And so he talked about how we're getting used to this sort of out of time kind of mentality, and it's more comfortable. that we actually prefer
Yeah,
it, the tweets, the emails,
correct.
the text messages, to actually having a real conversation where I can't just, flip my phone over and ignore your text for an hour. When you ask me a question, I have to respond to it. And so actually even that skill of existing in the now with someone else,
Yep.
even that is fading. So I thought that was an interesting point there.
Yeah, it's an easy out because yeah, we can take our time or maybe not even respond or respond in a different emotional way than we would have in person that second or research some data to like have some things drummed up from the internet to have ready to go. Yeah, it's a lot different, but yeah, we become comfortable with that. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Another point that you mentioned too is Hebrews 12 and and shaking off the things that are going to slow us down in the race that's before us.
Hmm.
And these things aren't necessarily bad per se. It depends on what we're calling out as an example. But if they're not bad, but if they're weighing us down and they're changing our mindset too to have these things that are not putting us in the world that God has created, that kind of separating us from that. It's
Hmm.
gonna slow us down. It's gonna give us some hiccups in life, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the last one that I was going to hit on just real quick is we crave immediate approval or we get lonely
Yeah.
as that I think the one chapter I referenced. There was so I'll give another example of like a story he led off with. He led off with a I think she was a model on Instagram or a model on the internet somewhere, and she was like doing quite well, and she ended up giving up it all up. And she
Yeah.
was like, it's all fake, it's all drummed up. I don't even like the product I was promoting, or I didn't look like that. Like this is what I look like now. Like, and and I don't think she any mentioned anything about God or spiritual or any type of like reason from like a philosophical standpoint or anything. It was just like I realized it was empty,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
And I'm stepping away. So I thought that was an interesting lead in to the story to the chapter, excuse me. And I think, and I did want to say this at the beginning too. I think each of these chapters, as you read them, if you go through and you just, I read a few just now. You're like, okay, that's obvious. That's
Hmm.
clearly a thing that I know with smartphones too. But Tony writes it in a way that helps you think a lot more about the different problems that can arise from that struggle, what have you. And I would say a little bit more eclectically and a little more well-rounded, as well as
Hmm.
a balanced approach. And so it's like that's why I didn't want to offer this book if it was something that was pretty straightforward. I think he hits this, and it's a great reference to go back to.
Yeah.
I really honestly should read this like twice a year to be of real good benefit and really impact my life. But yeah, so this chapter I think was good because like okay, yeah, we get lonely, but I think he talks about the I hate to use the word fakeness. I guess it is the fakeness of you could post something on Facebook
Yeah.
or somewhere at Reddit somewhere where you're hiding behind your username, or you could change your profile picture. You can be a different person, but you can still have this quasi relationship with people because you're still talking to people, but it's in a different manner, like you were saying. So it feels as if you're not lonely,
Hmm.
but you still are. And he talks about, if I remember, I think this is the chapter where he talks about some of Paul's interactions in the scripture where he talks about like, hey, whatever
Yes.
church he's writing to, I really miss seeing you. I hope to see you soon, but I want to see you in person. I don't want to just write to you again.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he talks about these real relationships where you want to actually go and see the person, not just like text them or call them or
Hmm.
email them. So I
Right.
thought that was really excellent about that chapter as well, about the realness of relationships and that quasi loneliness that you think dissipates of sorts when you're interacting online, but it doesn't in the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really like you mentioned kind of some of those diagnostic questions. There are a few times in the books, or in the book, he gives you some diagnostic questions, and
Mhm.
those are really helpful. Again, just as a reference, because when you're sitting there, each question you could sit and ponder for a while. But when I was reading through the
Yeah.
book, I didn't necessarily take that time right then and there to go through each question. One, I do find myself, or I found myself since I've read it, asking myself repeatedly is, why did I just pick up my phone? Like, what was the purpose
Hmm.
of it?
Hmm.
Like every time I pick up my phone, because it becomes a habit.
Hmm.
It's quiet
Hmm.
for just 30 seconds and I pick up my phone. But then that question jumps to my head. Well, wait, why did I pick up my phone? And it's such a good question.
Yeah.
So he has
Yeah.
several times through the book where he gives you this list of diagnostic questions to really help you, especially like at the end of the book when he's like, okay, what do we do now? Well, here's some good questions to ask yourself after reading all this to kind of decide, well, what should you do with this information?
Yeah. Two other small points from that chapter two, I think we hit on it a little bit, is that he talks about when you're hiding behind a profile picture, a username in Twitter or what have you, um, you're not having the natural interactions in person where you might have someone that's a little bit constructively criticizing you or being honest with you. Where online, people are either going to be really pandering to you or they're going to be like heavy hitting and some random person out of the blue, like you don't even know from the person down the road, but they're like complaining and yelling at you online about something. But you're not having the natural, like, hey, you could actually bounce things off of people and they could be
Yeah.
honest with you. Hey, I think you should be doing this a little bit better. You're not really going to get that online or even that feel of that online, the natural interactions with people. So that was good. And the other point, and I won't go into it because I'll let people read the book on its own, but I appreciate it. He talks about the difference between glory and approval.
Hmm.
And he uses some scripture around that, like how we seek and desire approval. But what about God's glory? Versus, well, maybe we're trying to get our own glory, but the definition of how he defines glory versus approval is something to intrigue people to check out.
Well,
But that was another point in the chapter.
one difference he makes that just when you were saying that reminded me, I really enjoyed thinking about was the difference between a hero and a celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
I mean, just this idea that time makes a hero and time kills a celebrity, right? Yeah, and like he really
Mm-hmm.
pulls it apart and lets you see those two and how we should have this idea of a hero, not necessarily a celebrity, right? And it's a very interesting. I really enjoyed thinking through that and seeing how
Yeah, agreed.
social media, the smartphone really promotes the one and not the other. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks
So
for bringing it up.
are there things, any areas in the book that you would be cautious about when suggesting it to someone, things that are kind of little red flags for you?
I can't think of any. I would just say, yeah, I think he has a well-balanced approach, and I don't think he's like trying to look over your shoulder and heavy-handed, just like, call you out. I think he's, yeah, like, as you were mentioning with the questions, I think he's just saying, really take a good introspective look at your life and
Hmm.
how you're using your phone or internet or social media. And say, is it God honoring? And ask a lot of the questions in the conclusion or in some of the chapters, because I think that'll help you use your phone wisely
Hmm.
and correctly and in a God honoring way. So I don't think there's any red flags per se. I think I would recommend this to people that have a smartphone, people that don't,
Yeah.
because if you don't have one, you still might use the internet, you
Hmm.
still might use email, text message, because these remote ways of interacting and connecting with people still have these nuances that he's hitting on here in this book. So I'd say even if you don't have a smartphone, I think it's he doesn't just keep it to that because he really can't at the end of
Right.
the day.
Right.
So I wouldn't just recommend it to people that have smartphones. I think I would say in general um, to anyone that could maybe benefit from understanding how to use technology today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, he makes a point. There was a very small window when people made the decision, like, should I get a smartphone or not? Right. And that time has passed. Right? We are now in the world where,
Oh yeah.
every almost every middle schooler it has a smartphone,
Yep.
and they're flooding our lives. And so he says, like it or not, we need to know how do we approach this and how do
Hmm.
we approach it biblically. And I think this book is a very good resource. I couldn't think of any either. You can tell, you mentioned the beginning, he works with John Piper and in Desiring God. And there are a few points in the book where you can tell he thinks very highly of John Piper, where he'll say, "Oh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
he thinks this," and
yeah.
you could tell that a few points. But really excellent points, like you said, well
Mhm.
balanced. I think anyone who, I mean, I've already like this was of the recent books I've read. It's the one I've most quickly recommended to
Oh
people.
yeah, that's
And
awesome.
then
Hmm.
they've jumped into it, and I've only gotten positive feedback from the people I've recommended it to. So
Oh,
yeah,
that's great.
very, very helpful.
Yeah,
Um, are there any suggestions you would have on how to get the most out of this book? I mean, we talked about those diagnostic questions. I would
yeah,
definitely say, uh, even if like I like to keep plowing through the book, when but to go back, revisit those questions. I think that would be very beneficial. Rereading those questions, almost like you said, almost, you know, even
mm,
if it's twice a year, going back, reviewing that sort of thing.
yeah. I would definitely say to read the preface and the introduction.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, the introduction is huge because it really is a chapter one in any book. And the preface I think is really good too because he tees up a little bit of like why he wrote the book, why technology, what would it, how's it impacting his life. And the conclusion I think is really big too. I was actually just I pulled it up just now. He asked himself 12 questions when he's thinking about like breaking away from technology altogether or getting rid of his smartphone or what have you, like about cost, about how I'm using texting, how am I using the mobile web, do I really need it in various ways. So yeah, I would definitely say appreciate and take time on the questions. The other thing I would say is each chapter is that mindset of we feed on the produced. So he is hitting that hard. So yes, there are like subsections and small little like paragraph sections that you could pause of sorts if you have
Yeah.
to run and do something. But I would recommend to try to read the whole chapter in one sitting, if even if you have to go back another time, but like because it's very comprehensive in whatever he's trying to focus on. That it's really great. They're not too long.
No.
I'd say most of the chapter looks like they're about 14, 15. Oh yeah, one's 10 pages long. So it's not like a chapter is very long.
Right.
So I would probably recommend that to really get a lot out of the chapters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the Audible audio book is free. So if you do have Audible,
Okay.
it is one of the free books that you can just
Mm,
download for free, which I always think that's great. Now, but
yeah.
again, if you're doing that, sometimes with the flow of things, I found like the questions again. That would be something, if it just reads the questions, you don't have hardly
Yeah.
any time to stop and think.
Mhm.
And so I think that is one downside with using that medium with this book
Yeah.
particularly.
I would I there's one other quote I wanted to not forget, and I think you used it quite well, is in Screwtape Letters with C.S. Lewis, which is interesting that this was like, what, 70, 80 years
Yeah.
ago. And C.S. Lewis talks about the nothing strategy in Screwtape Letters, where it says that a man at the end of his life looks back and says, I now see that I spent most of my life in doing neither what I ought nor what I liked.
Mm,
And he goes into the nothing strategy is very strong, strong enough to steal away a man's best years, not in sweet
wow.
sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not know what or why. Gratification of curiosity is so feeble that the man is only half aware of them. And it sounds so much like what we're doing with the death scroll or
Yeah.
online or on our phones, where we're seeing a lot of things. I mean, like, okay, yeah, I could pull up Blue Letter Bible or Amplified Bible or something that is very beneficial, but I'm saying for the most part, other things that are things do we really need? It's more of a fear of missing out. Do we really need to check on them? And to hear C.S. Lewis talk about this from 80 years ago, um, it's kind of crazy. But I think he uses examples, stories, metaphors, quotes really well, besides Bible verses to help us understand God's take on it.
Yeah, and it just shows that the smartphone didn't invent new vices.
Hmm.
Right. It's just accentuates different things. It just makes
Or
certain
makes them
ones
easier.
more readily available,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. And that's why, like in Piper does a foreword, and he likens the smartphone to a mule, right?
Hmm.
And he says
Hmm.
we should get it to work hard. We've got these supercomputers in our
Yep.
pockets that we can get to work hard. And, we think about someone like Gutenberg and the printing press, right? Here's a guy, and for the cause of Christ, he invented the printing press. And so,
Mhm,
like, we
mhm.
should be, if uh, you know, if following what God wants in our life, we should be on the cutting edge of technology to
Yep.
further his things. Now, again, just because you create the printing press doesn't mean it will always be used for the Lord, right?
Yeah.
Lots of horrible things have been printed using the printing press, but that's what he's saying is you've got this worker
Hmm.
inside your pocket that you can work, and that goes back to this balanced idea.
And I think if I remember, I think he kind of says when you look back in your life, how did you use the tool or the mule in his example? Like, will you look back and say, I used it wisely, it worked hard for me, it did all the things that purpose to, or it dragged me along, type of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right.
Mm,
Yeah. Um, I was thinking, like, while going through the book,
mhm.
uh, or maybe not while going through the book, but in reflection, maybe taking certain notes as you go through, and then taking time to
Yep.
apply. I think, especially depending on what it is you feel
Mhm.
convicted about,
Yep.
it can take some time. Like, even me, where I pick up my phone out of habit, and it's like, oh, I gotta ask the question, why did I pick up the phone? And
Hmm.
taking the time to apply those over time, because again, if we've started some sort of habit, and I one thing I liked about this book, and usually I don't like this about books, is um there were certain chapters I felt didn't apply very much to me. But
Okay.
I like that because some chapters applied very much to me. And I
Okay.
and there's
Oh,
such a
interesting.
diversity when it comes to social media. I see it with some people and say, oh, they're, you know, doing this, that, or whatever. That doesn't, that just doesn't entice me. But I know
Hmm.
it does to other people. And so I'm glad he didn't write just about what entices him, right? But
Oh, I see your point.
it was
Yeah.
a much
Yeah. Very true.
wider view at
Hmm.
social media and the smartphone. But there were certain ones that definitely, applied to me. And then in those areas, whatever those areas are, taking time, going through the questions, really thinking through it, and then taking time to apply it and to keep it on the forefront of the mind. Don't just let it say, oh, yeah, that was interesting, and then move on.
Yeah. I think another point, I forget in what chapter he might have emphasized this, but I think sometimes we think um like we need to have a lot of time on our phone to use something profitable. Like let's say I pull up a Bible app and I'm reading my Bible in there, or just as an example. But we can do quick things with our phone. So I could think of a few examples that have benefited me where, like if I think of a quick thought during the day that might help um, with speaking or encouraging someone, whatever, you can write it down in your notes. Or there's an app, I forget the name of it, but it every day it generates an unreached people in the world, and you can pray for that unreached people. Kind of tells them like where they are,
Oh, yeah.
what nationality, what language they speak, whatever, and you can kind of pray for them, and the gospel would reach them. Or like so like quick little things you can pull up. Let's say you only have like 3 minutes between stuff. There was a point when I was working at a hospital where there was a an underground pathway that I would have to take in the wintertime to get from one building to another, and it's this long stretch that would probably took me like 5, 6, 7 minutes to walk because it's such a long distance. But I could pull up my phone and pull up a book or a Bible or whatever to use that time while I'm maybe carrying things or pushing things, but one building to the other. That I could use that time rather than just okay, here's 5, 6, 7 minutes. I'm taking a long walk. So we don't need to think like I need to have some you know exorbitant amount of time to do something profitable. Even something quick could be done for good or for bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the phone has allowed us to do that sort of thing. The fact that I can sit here on my phone and pull up the same document I have on my work computer, right? Because of the
Yeah.
cloud. I mean, it's
Mhm.
amazing. It's amazing. And my dad who was in printing, 40 years ago, right? I can do more amazing things on my phone than he could do with, a staff. I mean, it
Mhm.
really is amazing what is at our fingertips.
Yeah.
But again, there's that balance where if certain things we go over the edge with, and they're a detriment, but other things there it's like it opens up whole new worlds and ways to do things. And so it is a tricky topic, and I think be
Mhm.
he did a really good job at approaching it and not pushing, you need to do this. And I like he has a point in the conclusion at the end where he says, we need to not judge someone who chooses something differently than us. So
Mhm.
the person who says, no, I'm not going to use these apps,
Mhm.
right? It's not profitable for me. I'm not going to use them. And then the other person who says, no, this allows me to reach these people, or it allows me to do these things. I am going to use those apps, right?
Yeah.
And again, here's a situation where they don't do it for the glory of God, and these people do it for the glory of God.
Yeah.
And not just saying, you shouldn't be doing it or you should be doing it, but allowing the Lord to direct each one of us um, in those specific areas.
Yeah. No, it's a valid point because then it helps us to not judge and to understand each person's approach to this very thing. Because I can think of an app that I've really not used for years because it's not been the best for me. But I can think of my cousin who shares Bible verses there and does various videos and things on there that it's very profitable to a lot of people. So like
Yeah.
to each their own and the ways that they're convicted for sure.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So good, good. Yeah, very helpful book. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommend it. So thank you for spending the time and
Sure.
walking us through it.
Thank you.